Billionaire investor's daughter showed no respect. Judge Caprio's verdict changed her life. Layla Marcone's heels clicked against the polished floor with a rhythm that seemed louder than the murmurs in the courtroom. She didn't look up from her phone, didn't acknowledge the clerk's polite reminder to silence it. The room stirred, not because anyone had shouted, but because presence has weight, and hers was impossible to ignore. Even among a gallery accustomed to minor infractions, to drivers arguing over parking tickets or small fines, she seemed otherworldly, untouchable, as if the very law were something ornamental, a background decoration for everyone else but her. She sank into her chair with a deliberate theatrical sigh, surveying the room slowly, like a queen waiting for acknowledgement. The faint glances of spectators bounced off her carefully measured aura of indifference. Her name was called once, twice before she rose, moving with the lazy precision of someone who believed the world would always yield. Every step carried the shadow of her father's fortune, Victor Marconi, the financier whose investments dotted the skyline, whose influence had extricated the family from countless moments where law and consequence brushed too close to ambition. Approaching the bench, her irritation flared subtly, just enough to show impatience, not enough to break composure. Judge Caprio, calm and deliberate, observed her stride and the challenge glinting in her eyes. When she finally lifted her gaze toward him, it was a question without words. She expected deference. He expected respect. The quiet tension settled between them, an unspoken prelude. In that room for that moment, privilege met principle, and the first notes of the clash that would follow were already playing. An SUV, school zone, ticketed. Layla's words were clipped, deliberate, delivered as if she were summarizing something trivial. Her eyes flicked around the courtroom, not in apology, not in concern, but in measured expectation. It was only for a minute. No sensible officer would ticket a vehicle that expensive. She allowed a faint smirk to curve her lips, as though the idea of accountability itself was laughable. The gallery stiffened. Officers, clerks, and spectators alike sensed the tension rise. This wasn't just about a parking violation anymore. It was about a mindset, a belief that the rules existed for everyone but her. Judge Caprio listened, unflinching, his face unreadable, his presence steady against the small storm she carried in her voice. When he requested Officer Medina's report, Layla rolled her eyes so openly that the subtle reaction rippled across the courtroom. The report confirmed it. Her luxury SUV had blocked the crosswalk at dismissal. Children had been forced to weave between cars, darting through potential danger, guided by the frantic gestures of the crossing guard. Exaggerated, Layla said, voice tight but dismissive. Officers like to make an example of people who look successful. Caprio's gaze met hers. Do you believe your status exempts you from the rules? She paused, a fraction of hesitation in her otherwise polished armor. I expected reasonable treatment, she said finally, a phrase more revealing than she realized. The courtroom felt it, the collision between entitlement and law, between inherited influence and the immutable reality that safety and order do not bend for wealth. Her world, long insulated by privilege, was beginning to crack against the unyielding weight of principle. The screen flickered to life. Children hesitated, small feet shifting around the polished black SUV that seemed to fill the entire crosswalk. Parents shouted warnings, voices sharp and urgent, but the scene played on relentlessly, each second a record of what Layla had dismissed with a flick of her wrist. The crossing guard gestured repeatedly, frustration radiating from every impatient wave, but she had seen none of it, or chose not to. Layla's hand rose, a subtle interruption. It looks worse than it really was, she said, her voice tight, calculated. The murmurs from the gallery grew, a low tide of disbelief, as the playback refused to bend to her narrative. The camera captured the near miss, a small boy's foot teetering dangerously close to moving traffic. Caprio's eyes met hers. Look closely. Understand the danger you created. Her jaw tightened. She didn't speak. Instead, she let the frame linger, pretending indifference, hiding discomfort behind practiced posture. I didn't know it was that serious, she offered finally, voice sharp but devoid of true contrition. Why not use the designated area? Caprio asked, patient but probing. Layla exhaled a flicker of irritation. It was full. I had a meeting. The courtroom grew colder, heavier. Convenience had become a weapon, privilege a blindfold. Her fleeting annoyance had endangered lives. The conflict was no longer about a fine. It was about the philosophy she carried, a worldview where rules existed for others, not for her. Caprio's gaze lingered, steady and unyielding, as if measuring the distance between arrogance and accountability. Do you understand the weight of your actions? Caprio asked, calm but piercing. Layla crossed her arms, a shield against the courtroom, against judgment, against any intrusion into the world she had long controlled. People exaggerate the risks, she said sharply, her words tight, rehearsed. The crossing guard should have been more patient. Her voice carried the faint edge of accusation, as though responsibility belonged to anyone but her. A ripple of disbelief ran through the audience. Eyebrows raised, quiet murmurs threading across the benches. Caprio's eyes softened, but his question sharpened. Tell me about your upbringing. Were rules always optional? Layla bristled, tone cold. I don't need psychoanalysis, she said, voice clipped. Every syllable revealed her armor. Privilege, convenience, a life insulated from the consequences ordinary people face daily. The judge did not press for excuses. He pressed for comprehension, for understanding the distance between wealth and accountability. A voice rose from the gallery. A mother, trembling yet steady, asked to be heard. She spoke of the day her son had nearly been struck, describing the fear that had seized her heart as the blocked crosswalk forced her child into danger. There was no anger, no accusation, only truth, raw and human. Layla turned slowly, her gaze meeting the mother's. For a heartbeat, arrogance faltered. Recognition flashed in her eyes, faint and fleeting, before she tried to hide it. The first cracks appeared, subtle tremors where privilege had once been unassailable. Privilege is not a shield, Caprio said, leaning forward, his voice low but resonant, carrying a weight that filled every corner of the courtroom. I've seen this countless times. One careless choice, one moment of disregard, and lives are altered forever. Layla's composure wavered, just slightly, the sharp edge of her dismissiveness blunted by the gravity of his words. This was no longer a discussion about tickets or inconvenience. It was a moral reckoning. The air seemed heavier, every witness, every observer aware that the scales of accountability were tilting beyond mere law into something deeper, something human. Responsibility grows with privilege, Miss Marconi. Not the other way around, he continued. Your father's wealth, your lifestyle, the assumptions you carry about exemption, they mean nothing when children's safety is at stake. She opened her mouth to argue, to reclaim her narrative, but Caprio's hand, calm and deliberate, stopped her mid-thought. Respect is not purchased. Humility is not a performance. It is a choice you make in the moments when it matters most. Her eyes dropped. Not shame, not yet, but recognition. A flicker of understanding, fragile and tentative, began to pierce the armor she had long worn. For the first time, she saw not just the court, but herself, measured against the reality she had ignored. The tension in the room shifted, quieted into a deeper, more resonant pressure. Everyone could feel it. A verdict was forming, one that would carry more than monetary consequence. It would demand moral reckoning. Miss Marconi, the fine will remain, Caprio said, his voice steady, commanding attention without raising it. The room seemed to inhale, waiting for the customary conclusion, but it did not come. Additionally, because your actions directly endangered children, you will spend 3 afternoons assisting the school's crossing guard team during dismissal. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Layla's eyes widened, disbelief flashing, quickly mingling with reluctant acceptance. The weight of the decision was unlike any monetary penalty she had encountered. Caprio's gaze held hers, unyielding. Accountability is not measured in checks. It is measured in confronting the impact of your actions directly. He paused, letting the words settle, their gravity pressing into the room. Your record will reflect compliance, not wealth. Privilege does not grant immunity, and this is not punishment. It is guidance toward understanding, toward empathy. Layla opened her mouth, a flicker of argument ready to rise, but the memory of the mother's trembling voice, the still frame of the child stepping into danger, held her silence. Slowly she nodded, not fully humbled, not transformed entirely, but no longer untouched. The courtroom absorbed the resonance of the moment. Spectators exchanged quiet, approving glances, sensing the moral gravity beyond the law. For the first time, Layla stood differently, head poised, posture hinting at respect, as justice reached beyond punishment and began shaping conscience. I never realized, Layla began, her voice steady, carrying a weight it had never held before, how much goes into keeping children safe every single day. She stood beside the crossing guard team, her designer polish replaced by the practicality of experience, her posture less performative, more human. Weeks of walking the line, assisting with dismissal, had stripped away the assumptions that wealth could insulate her from consequences. She recounted the chaos, the constant vigilance required, the split-second decisions that kept children from harm, the pace, the unpredictability. It's exhausting. And I understood finally that my assumptions about privilege, about being above it all, they feel hollow now. The guards nodded, confirming her participation. They spoke of how she listened attentively, asked questions, and even suggested ways to make the pattern safer. Not as a chore, but as an act of genuine engagement. The courtroom absorbed the quiet image of transformation, one earned through humility rather than coerced obedience. Caprio's gaze held hers. Do you now see why the law applied to you as firmly as anyone else? She nodded openly this time. I do, and I'm grateful. Grateful I didn't hurt anyone, and grateful for the lesson I never expected. As the session ended, she walked out with head leveled, not lowered. The same courtroom that had once stiffened at her arrogance now witnessed her measured presence. A reminder that justice, when delivered with insight and firmness, reshapes perspective, not just behavior. Alessia entered with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her long coat, cream-colored with a subtle sheen, swayed as she walked, and the sunglasses shielding her eyes seemed almost theatrical, signaling a confidence that bordered on defiance. Her heels clicked against the floor in a precise rhythm, a quiet drumbeat announcing her presence. And then, as her eyes lifted to meet the bench, she smirked. Not a polite curl of the lips, not a nervous twinge. A full, careless smirk aimed directly at Judge Caprio. The room inhaled collectively. Judge Caprio's gaze remained calm, almost gentle in its stillness. He waited, letting the moment stretch. Alessia, accustomed to smiles bending outcomes, expected something. A laugh, a raised eyebrow, a minor comment, a nod, a signal that her status could bend reality. Instead, he simply watched. The silence was heavier than any word, a tangible assertion that the courtroom did not operate on charm or pedigree. For the first time, her usual armor, the luxury, the connections, the expectation of leniency, met an unyielding wall of authority. She glanced at her attorney, who offered a subtle shrug, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary traffic citation. The officer who had written the ticket, Daniel Riley, sat in the front row, clipboard resting against his chest, observing with a quiet pride. His presence reminded everyone that this was not a ceremonial gesture. It was the law being laid bare. Alessia's mind raced, calculating options, rehearsing defenses, imagining potential leniency. She realized that charm would not suffice here, yet habit urged her to try. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if the words would betray her. The ticket itself was deceptively mundane. A Maserati, black, registration RI 9XJ 344, caught on radar at 54 in Malpiramasser in a 25 mph school zone at 7:58 a.m., when visibility was reduced by light rain, and the crossing guard, Mrs. Hazel Durant, had already begun signaling children across Elmwood Avenue. There were photographs, precise measurements of stopping distances, and witness statements. But to Alessia, this was all background noise, secondary to the real game. Persuasion, influence, subtle negotiation. She had never been wrong in situations like this, until now. The gallery of onlookers, A mix of local residents, journalists, and students observing the morning session felt the tension immediately. Whispered guesses about her family, the scale of their wealth, and her social influence spread like static across the benches. Some anticipated a spectacle, a lecture, a minor slap on the wrist, a performance of remorse. Others, the regular citizens who had watched similar cases, felt the anticipation sharpen into something more profound, the first encounter between privilege and principle. Alessia's smirk faded fractionally as Judge Caprio finally spoke. Miss Moretti, his voice was calm, measured, but each syllable carried gravity. You are here because you were observed exceeding the speed limit in a school zone. Children were present. A crossing guard intervened. You are a citizen before the law like any other. The words were simple, unequivocal, and yet they struck with force. For a moment, Alessia's mind blanked. She had never been called a citizen in this context. Never in her life had her identity been reduced to an ordinary responsibility. She could feel the eyes in the courtroom, measuring, questioning, waiting for her next move. Her attorney coughed softly, attempting to interject, but Alessia raised a hand ever so slightly, almost reflexively. This was a familiar dance. She would speak, charm, explain, excuse, redirect. But the judge's calm presence stopped her mid-motion. There was no bend, no give. The power imbalance, once invisible, now pulsed in every corner of the room. Her smirk had been her shield, her declaration of untouchability. It had failed. She shifted, a slight tilt of her shoulders, the tiniest crease forming between her brows. In that instant, the room could read every flicker of uncertainty she had spent years hiding. The officer noted it. The clerk noted it. Even the quiet crowd in the back row sensed it. The smirk that had opened the story, the emblem of entitlement and expectation, had collided with an immovable calm. And in that collision, the narrative had changed. As she prepared to respond, the first tendrils of doubt began to creep into her mind. Not about the ticket, not about the fine. About herself, her assumptions, the invisible rules she had believed governed her life. Judge Caprio's gaze never wavered, and Alessia realized, perhaps for the first time, that the world outside her bubble operated on principles she could not negotiate. The courtroom settled, breaths held in anticipation. Outside, the rain softened into a gentle drizzle, washing the streets of Elmwood Avenue, as if nature itself waited for the next move. Alessia's smirk was gone. In its place, a quiet awareness. And somewhere in that silence, the first seeds of accountability had taken root. The morning light in Providence was muted behind a low-hanging gray sky, the courthouse steps damp from overnight drizzle. Inside Courtroom A, the air smelled faintly of old oak and polished brass, the kind of scent that clings to memory. Alessia Moretti arrived not alone, but flanked by a small entourage of attorneys and assistants, each carrying meticulously organized folders and laptops. Their movements were precise, almost rehearsed, as if entering this room was another stage, another performance. Her attorneys had filed continuance after continuance, citing international brand shoots, speaking in tones meant to convey urgent travel and professional necessity. Yet flight records later revealed a truth Alessia hoped remained hidden. She had never crossed state lines. Rhode Island had been her only destination, and the work she claimed was more a fiction than reality. Still, she carried herself as if she were untouchable, each step measured, each glance calculated. She smiled faintly at the gallery, as though acknowledging an audience that existed purely to admire her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, almost anticipatory. The gallery shifted subtly, sensing the tension that would not be deflected by charm or fame. Judge Caprio, 63, seasoned and resolute, didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the courtroom, landing on Isabella with measured intent, and he spoke again. In this courtroom, your privilege does not precede the law. The words hung in the air, simple yet weighty, and Isabella's fingers twitched slightly as she caught herself gripping the edge of the table. It was the first hint that confidence alone would not protect her. Around her, subtle cues betrayed the strain beneath her polished exterior. A tightened jaw, a flicker of narrowed eyes. the barely noticeable swallow when she realized her social influence could not automatically secure favor. Even her entourage stiffened, whispers pausing mid-sentence. Sensing the shift in energy, Isabella had spent her life wielding her family name like armor, yet here it meant nothing against the steady authority of a man who had seen countless attempts at intimidation come and fail. She tried a casual nod toward the courtroom staff, a soft laugh to suggest ease, but it faltered. Caprio's gaze remained unyielding, the kind that quietly measures every gesture, every claim, every pretense. The room, though small, seemed to shrink around her arrogance, the walls pressing her entitlement back into sharp relief. There was no applause for her arrival, no deference, only the unspoken gravity of a legal system ready to treat her like any other citizen. A reporter whispered to a colleague just loud enough for Isabella to hear. "She looks so sure. Wonder when the first crack will appear?" The comment, innocuous to some, struck at the core of her carefully curated persona. She had walked in expecting recognition, a hint of leniency, a nod to her family's influence. Instead, she encountered a wall of impartiality, one that would not bend for beauty, wealth, or charm. Isabella's mind raced, a flurry of rehearsed defenses, potential appeals to influence, and strategic smiles. Yet beneath it all, a thread of unease had begun to weave through her composure. She had never needed to negotiate authority like this before. Every decision, every glance, every whispered instruction felt heavier than usual, charged with the implicit warning that her carefully constructed world could unravel faster than she realized. As Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, allowing the words to sink, Isabella caught herself thinking not of the reporters or the gallery, but of the evidence she knew she could not control, the facts, the footage, the witnesses, and most importantly, the weight of real consequence that no amount of privilege could erase. The room remained quiet, the tension almost tangible, and in that pause, the collision between her entitlement and the impartial authority of the law became undeniable. She had arrived expecting deference, but what she faced instead was clarity. In this courtroom, everyone is equal before the law, and no diamond bracelet, no designer coat, and no family name could change that. It was a fragile moment, the beginning of an unraveling, a hint of vulnerability beneath the veneer of power. Isabella realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that confidence alone was no shield, and that the story about to unfold would test every assumption she had ever held about her place in the world. The morning sun glinted one last time on her bracelet, a silent witness to the arrogance that now faced its reckoning. When the bailiff walked in, she didn't acknowledge him. She glanced at her watch instead, flicking her wrist with polished annoyance. She had the air of someone convinced the day would bend around her schedule the moment she spoke. The clerk called out a routine case from the list, but her gaze didn't shift. She remained standing, poised, as if another person's hearing was an inconvenience interrupting her rightful place at the front. A man 2 rows back muttered, "She's not even pretending." He wasn't wrong. There was no attempt to blend in, no hint of humility, no trace of uncertainty. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years drifting through doors that opened simply because of the name she carried beside her own. When her heel tapped again, 3 crisp strikes, it wasn't impatience anymore. It was a warning, an announcement, a signal to the room that when her name was called, the atmosphere would change with it. And everyone sensed she believed she'd already won, even before she stepped up to answer for the one thing she chose not to do. She wasn't there to comply, she was there to be the exception. The clerk slid the folder across the desk, its surface worn from years of routine cases, but the paperwork inside told a different story. Her name sat at the top of the file, printed neatly above the words most people never dared to ignore. Court order. Mandatory compliance within 30 days. A simple instruction. Proof of documentation, nothing burdensome, nothing confusing, nothing that required explanation. Yet the order remained untouched. When the judge read her case aloud, she lifted her chin with the confidence of someone accustomed to being inconvenienced only by choice. She stepped forward with the same controlled composure she wore at charity dinners, pausing just long enough to make the moment feel like she was granting permission for the proceedings to begin. The judge asked why she never complied. She exhaled with practiced grace. The notice was misguided, she said. This was all a misunderstanding. There must have been an error somewhere, maybe in your system. Someone in the back let out the faintest breath of disbelief. The judge flipped another page. You received 3 reminders. She gave a small, dismissive nod. Mail is unreliable, and the city misfiles things constantly. I've dealt with this before. It's nothing unusual. The way she said the city, as if it were a cluster of incompetent workers fumbling to keep up with her world, made the courtroom go still. Did you contact the Wadui court? The judge asked. She smiled, the kind reserved for waitstaff who brought the wrong wine. I didn't think it was necessary. My husband works long hours at the hospital. I handle everything at home. We're very busy people. The judge tapped the file lightly. This order wasn't optional. Her expression tightened for the first time. It was slight, barely a ripple, but enough to expose a truth she'd spent years covering with polished manners. She wasn't used to anyone telling her what she had to do. She leaned in slightly, trying to redirect the moment. If this had reached the right department, none of us would be here wasting time. I assume someone misplaced the documentation. But the order wasn't lost. It wasn't misplaced. It wasn't misfiled. It was ignored, and everyone in the room could see it. Whether she realized it or not, her excuses revealed more than she intended. An ingrained belief that responsibility was optional for people like her, that consequences were things other people dealt with, that the law was something to be navigated, not followed. The judge looked down at the file again. She waited for him to acknowledge her reasoning, maybe even thank her for the explanation. But he didn't. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. You had 30 days. Why didn't you comply? Her smile faded this time, not out of remorse, but out of irritation. I told you, it simply wasn't a priority, and the room absorbed that sentence in full silence. At last, the truth slipped through the cracks. The rules were meant for everyone else. She wasn't one of them.